All right, welcome to Chapter 7. This is Strategy and Leadership. So these slides here revolve around leadership and how leaders enact strategy, create strategy, ways that organizations need strategy as well. And so we'll dive into some of the nuances here. First, this ties into our case study as well. So the case study assignment that we've got going on. So just a little bit of the background here in the AHL, which is the minor league system or minor league to the National Hockey League or NHL. Back when this book was first written and everything was constructed, the AHL was coming off its 75th anniversary. The league has also kind of gone through this resurgence back then, kind of like what we've seen with some of the other minor leagues throughout baseball as well. Really buying into the community ties, recognizing that some of the star players probably aren't going to be on a team for very long, certainly probably not their career, as guys continue to try to strive for the NHL or top prospects, especially in hockey. Sometimes they skip the AHL altogether and go right from the draft onto their NHL team. It doesn't always happen, and the AHL also has some age restrictions that make the system a little wonky compared to some of the other leagues that are out there. But again, just a little bit of the background here. The case study dives a little further into it all. So just some of our objectives here. You mentioned we're getting into characteristics of strategic leadership, how leaders enact and create strategy, and how it's important, especially with integrative thinking and strategy as well, and how it's evolved. Way back, the origin of the word strategy actually comes from the Greek word general, and was used back then as dubbed as the leader of the military, which may not be all that surprising, considering the word in its root is general, and then we also usually associate general and strategy with leading military type of forces as well. But for business side of things, it basically just means how are we going about our business for the organization. What are our guiding strategies, principles, mission, vision, all those kinds of things. So who we are, what we do, but also it kind of gets into the nuances of what we do day to day. How do we define success and go after success as an organization? How do we treat our employees? And that gets into some of the organizational culture aspects as well. But strategy really gets into some of the different components, and there's some differences in successful businesses and organizations and unsuccessful ones as well. In business, it's usually defined succinctly, a little bit more succinctly, as a means of creating that competitive advantage or how we can outperform our competitors. In sport, it's all around us. Think about the wave of analytics in baseball. You can think about some of the innovation in play calling in football, for example. You can think about in history of basketball and the triangle offense, or the influx of analytics there, and the Golden State Warriors, for example, realizing that hey, they've got a little bit more success, and the payoff is better if you shoot more threes. Things like that just kind of separate an organization or a team from its competitors. Part of it is, and a building block, a foundational block here, is a mission statement or mission. And it basically just describes what the organization is. It really defines who we are. So if think of it as an elevator pitch. If we're on an elevator with somebody else, and they ask, who are you? But you have to answer as your organization. This is probably going to be what you give them. This mission statement. It'll be succinct. It's not going to ramble on. We're not talking pages and pages of corporate literature or anything like that. But it really helps to provide direction internally and externally. So it helps provide that direction for the employees as well as the consumers, customers, and it informs everybody about the objectives of the organization as well. So some examples here, and one that I like the most is probably the NBA one here. So this one here, our mission is to be most successful and respected sports league in the world, guided by two principles. So not only do they kind of have that, hey, this is what we're going to achieve, but this is how we're going to achieve it. This is who we are. These principles are ingrained in our DNA. We'll grow and celebrate the game of basketball and also understand the popularity and visibility of teams, players, and league obligate us to demonstrate leadership and social responsibility. So growing and celebrating the game and rooted in social responsibility. That's kind of the mission for it. And we see a lot of that at the forefront of NBA decisions, especially how they've grown the game. We can compare that to some of the other ones here, U.S. Olympic Committee, for example, U.S. Soccer, and the NCAA. Now, our vision statement, the other foundational block to a strategy, is a little bit more forward-thinking. So whereas the mission statement is who we are, vision statement is where are we going? So again, if we put ourselves back on that elevator and we answer the question of who we are, that person might follow up, oh, okay, so what floor are you going to? Where are you going in the future? When are you going to get off this elevator and get onto something else? Well, we tell them our vision statement. And it's longer term. Usually 3 to 5 years is right around the sweet spot, depending on the organization and the industry, because anything too far ahead, and we might end up changing it or need to change it. Too short, and it's really just a goal. So the vision statement should be longer term. That 3 to 5 year spot usually is the sweet spot, because that allows us to take into account for any kind of changes within an industry, as well as within the world going on as well. Vision will hopefully inspire members of an organization, and this is a huge component of that transformational leadership aspect that we had mentioned way back in some of our earlier chapters. It also gets into some of the charisma and empowerment and how we communicate, which all tie into servant leadership and authentic leadership as well, and just leadership in general, really. So an example here of vision embodied. The Chinese Olympic Committee really thought hard about what they can do to continue to make Beijing in particular a hotbed for the Olympic Games, but also to kind of root it in some flexibility and innovation as well. So depending on how familiar you are with the Olympics, every city that bids on the Olympics and receives the bid, then there's some infrastructure building that needs to be done with it. Beijing kind of had the foresight that, hey, based off the mission, we want to be a competitive city every time that we bid for the Olympics. And then the vision is, how can we do this in a sustainable manner, and a manner where we're not having to always rebuild the infrastructure every single time. Well, that led them to the cube, as it's dubbed, and it can adapt for both the winter and the summer games. So during the winter games, inside this cube here that's pictured, the surface is ice, and they can change the ice depending on the event, so it could host any of the ice skating events or anything along those lines. And then during the summer, the surface changes. It goes from an ice arena to a water arena. The surface becomes water, so they can do some of the swimming events, for example, in there as well. So this vision helped kind of hit two birds with one stone, but this was enacted from their mission and their strategy to be able to enact the vision of continually being a competitive city for the Olympics. Now, developing strategy doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that happens in just one board meeting or one team building exercise. This is something that takes time, and it takes purpose as well. Anybody who comes in and says, hey, we got a strategy, it's done after one meeting, it's probably not going to be a good strategy, even with some of the most experienced and smartest business people out there. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of understanding, and usually, if an organization is really well run, it'll take a lot of input from people that have been there and newer people with newer ideas as well to kind of boil it all together here. To help that is Mintzberg's 5 Ps of developing strategy here. And this helps basically just get us on the right track for that purposeful planning for strategy here. So the 5 Ps, plan, just what's that course of action? What are we actually going to do? How are we going to do it? Ploy, which is a specific maneuver or aspect that hopefully outwits an opponent or gives us a competitive advantage. How can we create a niche in a part of the industry, or how can we increase our marketing efforts, or how can we sign free agents that nobody thinks will be able to sign, or how can we get better value? all those kinds of things in sport. Pattern, it's just consistency or an inconsistency in behavior. Hopefully it's consistent. If it starts to become inconsistent, then we have to reevaluate the pattern as well as the nuances of the organization. Next, we've got position, and so this is just the context or environment that an organization operates within. So what aspect of the industry are we in? If we're Nike, we're in the apparel environment. If we're a team, then we're within a league. And then finally, the fifth one is perspective. Organization as a pace setter or a follower. And this really ties into how aggressive our strategies are going to be. The more aggressive the strategy means that we're probably going to try to be a pace setter. And if we're less aggressive, probably means that we're going to be a follower. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It just means that we might be playing catch up a little bit, or we might observe other organizations that are pace setters and see where they stumble and try to learn from that and cut some corners from their failures within our own strategy as well. And that, over time, would lead to a competitive advantage for us because we're not going through those same failures that a pace setter would be. Obviously, the pace setter has those first mover advantages, and also it's nice to be out in front and be considered a leader as well. So it really just kind of depends on the perspective and the identity of the organization. Strategic focus can be achieved through these three different ways here. So it should be focused on organization's particular industry. It just doesn't make sense to jump out of our own industry and try to compete in something else without any kind of foresight or effort or thinking through it. Strategists also have to forecast. We have to kind of look in the future a little bit. What could disrupt our efforts? What could change the organization? What could flip the whole industry on its side? So we have to do a really thorough SWOT analysis. Evaluate those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, not just for the organization but the industry as a whole. One business case study that drives this home, and it's not sport related, but it really resonates and continues to be a telltale sign, is Kodak. If we're not familiar, it makes sense because Kodak used to be kind of at the forefront of taking pictures. Film, the cameras, going to develop pictures. It might be our parents or maybe grandparents who did this. I know growing up, going on family vacations, always had either the dispensable camera or kind of a family camera with the actual roll of film. And usually you go through a pharmacy or wherever and get the film developed after you're taking the pictures. And Kodak was kind of the name in pictures and that for daily and regular consumers. And with the rise of digital cameras in the mid-2000s or so, Kodak stayed pretty steadfast. Nothing's going to replace film. Nothing's going to replace film. While digital cameras became more and more common, more and more popular, they're easier, especially as social media started to take off with the now, I think, mostly debunked MySpace and the early phases of Facebook. And then the iPhone came along and just wiped it all out. Now, we didn't have to carry around a cell phone and a digital camera, or people didn't have to carry around a cell phone and digital camera. They had them both in the same device. So the digital cameras fell to the wayside, and Kodak definitely fell to the wayside. That's why it's not really as common. We might see some things here and there. I think they're holding on in certain iterations and try to, for developing pictures off of our phone if we want to print out and things like that at kiosks. But they're not the behemoth, business behemoth that they used to be. Blockbuster would be another similar one. With all the memes of blockbusters being dinosaurs now and all that since Netflix and everything came along and all that. So again, if we don't have that forecast and foresight, or we ignore it, we could potentially be left in the dust. And the third one here is communication. Among stakeholders in charge of strategy, again, just enveloping and making sure stakeholders are heard, they understand what the strategy is, and key stakeholders, especially board of directors or whoever it may be, probably have some insights that we want to make sure are heard and taken into consideration as well. Then to think strategically, this is kind of intuitive, but avoid tunnel vision. Again, we can't just think of, okay, it's all or nothing, and we're either going to see this through or the tunnel's going to collapse on us. Now we got to make sure that, hey, maybe there's a shortcut, or maybe there's some things that are further down the road that we need to take into account. And that gets into embracing flexibility. We want to stay the course, but we want to also be aware of and in position to take advantage of opportunities. So we can change our path or tweak the path a little bit if need be without sacrificing our whole strategy altogether. Hopefully, this just speeds it up. Then trial and error. This is something that is just going to always be out there for business and for sport organizations. Trial and error is kind of part of day-to-day life. Trying to build different organizational structures and cultures. One culture that works at one organization may not work at another. We see this in sport with different coaches. We can boil coaching down into two very simplistic examples. You're either a player's coach or you're a bit more of a dictator coach. It's my way or the highway. Both have proven successful at times. Both can be successful. And sometimes a team that's had a player's coach needs a team that needs a coach to come in and kind of be a little bit more hardlined. And vice versa can be true. But it's not always the case. It depends on the culture there. It depends on the team and the players. So again, some of it's a little bit of trial and error. That's why, if leadership didn't matter and coaching didn't matter and strategy from coaches didn't matter, then all the coaches would essentially be the same, and we wouldn't hire and fire anybody because we never fire anybody. Then big hairy goals, big hairy audacious goals. This comes from a little bit of the Lululemon literature, and as well as just kind of some of the more charismatic aspects of leadership and strategy, but really embracing them that are so compelling that they engage an entire organization. In one example, just throughout history, is NASA getting somebody on the moon. That rallied all of NASA. Probably had quite a few doubters throughout society and throughout the general public and everybody else, but they did it. So that big, hairy, audacious goal came through. It's got to be bold. It can't just be, we're going to have a winning season. That's not very bold. One for an organization would be, we're going to revolutionize how we handle analytics and integrate analytics into day-to-day games, such as the Tampa Bay Rays did with their fostering of using an opener, for example. That was kind of unrealistic at the time. It was also something that, even despite how ingrained analytics had become already in baseball, it was still kind of a step too forward for some teams, and now it's more and more common. Our last couple of slides just kind of summarize what strategic leaders need to be or who they are, and really think about the organization structure and hierarchy, and how we can integrate goal setting for the entire organization based off of strategy. And it's really important to make sure everything cascades together nicely and aligns. We don't want goals 2 or 3 levels down the hierarchy that don't help us achieve the whole strategy, the whole organization's goals. You have to be aware of creating cultures, enacting and being agents of change. We'll get into a little bit more of that in coming chapters and readings. People who support learning from mistakes. That gets into culture as well. If you can't learn from mistakes and can't make a mistake in an organization, it's probably not one that's very forgiving or one that's going to have people stick around for very long. Different leadership levels here. Again, this kind of goes through a little bit more in depth of how leaders can be strategic and helpful within creating and enacting organizational structure. Then lastly, we get into integrative thinking. This genius of the and, this notion of and. So leaders who can operate at this level and integrate thinking are able to examine those two potentially opposed thoughts and still make sense of them, still somehow make them coerce and work together. So for example, sport organization, they might have a problem or strategy of trying to come up with how the organization can pursue both public sources of revenue as well as private sources. And they seem kind of anatomically opposed. We see this especially with, at least back in the day, with facilities, stadiums, arenas, new ones, renovations, etc. Well, strategic leaders in sport have been able to reconcile both of them and have it work together. That could be from the team owner or raising funds on their own, as well as going to local governments to help some of the public sources, help fund some of the public sources. So that genius of the and has been working so much that now it's almost that's kind of the industry standard for the most part. So that wraps up Chapter 7, Strategy and Leadership.